All right, so we are here with Mr. John Anthony West and Laird Scranton, and we're in John's home at the moment. This is your home, right?
Yes, this is my home.
All right.
Some soon to become a museum.
And your large selection of books behind you.
Yes.
Now, I guess let's start with this. I mentioned this to you already. Graham Hancock just recently posted a video with Zahi and Hawass kind of blowing up. What were your thoughts on all that?
Well, there are a lot of long thoughts, but to try and keep them a bit briefer, Graham is a good friend, actually, and I am miraculously, given the history of the liaison, actually pretty on very good terms with Zahi. He doesn't understand how good our evidence is, but we're cordial. We have drinks together and sometimes a dinner together when I'm over in Egypt. And I could see that this was not going to be a successful venue, no matter what. Nobody was going to come out smelling of roses, in principle, and mainly, I should say, because in a real debate, Graham would have made mincemeat out of Zahi. He wouldn't have had a leg to stand on, and Zahi would not have liked that. And the press, if there was going to be any, particularly if it was the academic, or as I call it, the quackademic press, would rally behind Zahi, even though they really don't have a lot of respect for him. So I could see that this was no good, but Graham said, well, he'd already committed to it, and he had to go through with it. And I'm not so sure Zahi was too anxious about it either, because my great friend who organizes my trips for me, Mohammed Nazmi, who runs Quest Travel, does all my Egypt trips. He's a good friend of Zahi's too, and we saw that nothing good was going to come of it. But none of us had any idea that it would be this kind of a crazy thing to happen. Because Boval showed up in a slide for his Orion theory, which is central to the whole lost civilization, lost civilization, very ancient Egypt scenario, was on one of Graham's slides for opening the show, and Zahi has an absolute loathing for Boval, and this is mutual. But Zahi, there was absolutely no reason for him to explode the way he did and to turn this whole thing into something like, I don't know, a cross between Full Metal Jacket and the Marx Brothers. It was, and so whether or not there are going to be any repercussions, I'm still waiting. This is only a few days ago. I hope not, because this could reverberate and make it more difficult for us to get certain kinds of work done in Egypt than it already is. On the other hand, there might be a way to use it for our own benefit, and for the benefit of the whole, the whole research project. If we can turn it around in some way or another, I'll be talking with Mohammed and see if we can somehow or another make something constructive out of it. It doesn't look very possible, given the Facebook postings and the nature of Zahi's blow up, but Graham comported himself, I thought, very brilliantly. He was absolutely calm and cool and collected, and we'll see.
All right, Laird, any thoughts on it?
Well, this is a field where tempers sometimes flare, and tantrums are not uncommon. I've seen a few myself over the years. Zahi and Robert Boval have a long sad history back and forth on issues between the two of them, and cross accusations and cross blowing up with each other in print and so forth. It seems like a convenient excuse to bow out of a debate that Zahi might not have wanted to participate in.
That's a good point. All right, so we could start with either of you. Let's start with Laird. How did you get interested in researching Egypt and the Dogon?
It's actually by accident. My wife, Risa, who happens to be here today, had read a book called Unexplained by Jerome Clark, where each chapter of the book involved some unresolved mystery. And one of the chapters was about the Dogon and about knowledge they seemed to have about astronomy that wasn't appropriate to their status as a modern primitive African tribe. They shouldn't know and be able to detect without telescopes that there are two stars in that system, a bright star like the sun and a small dark star that's a dwarf star, but that orbits so closely to the bright star that you can't see it because of the glare of the bright star. And they knew things like the correct orbital period for the stars, and they knew they had other opinions about aspects of that system that even astronomers today haven't been able to necessarily verify. They have hints of, but haven't verified. So I thought that would make an interesting research project for myself, just for fun, and that took me down a long path that has led to comparative cosmology studies between cultures.
All right. And John, how long ago did you get interested in Egypt? Has it been a lifelong thing? Or?
No. It started in the middle 60s or so, and I'll go back a bit further than that. At a very early age, I was never a boy genius. You know, they turn on your television every week, there's some 8-year-old kid playing Beethoven's violin sonata upside down while standing on his head and eating an ice cream cone, and it really makes you feel stupid. I was never one of those. But what I was psychologically precocious. I knew at the age of 13 that I'd been born into a lunatic asylum. And everybody else thought it was just great and called it progress and all of that. But I knew it was a madhouse. And by the time I was 19, I knew what I wanted to do, which was to be a writer, and I wanted to be the little boy who said the emperor has no clothes. And I started, but I had no thought ever of scholarship. And basically my modus operandi was satire. And so I started writing, started getting published, plays, a novel, a book of short stories. And then I moved when my first short story was published or accepted. I was working on Madison Avenue. I was 25, wildly in love with a woman who, thank God, wouldn't have me, and otherwise I'd have stayed there. And gotten around to writing The Man in the Dark Gray Flannel Suit and the Man in the Double-Breasted Dark Gray Flannel Suit, and so on. And anyway, I'd been in Europe a year and a half in the army of 53 to 55. And so I wanted to go back to Europe, where they named streets after poets, to get my writing done. And again, more long story, but I found my way to this magical island of Ibiza, which became the party capital of the world. Then it wasn't the party capital of the world, it was this essentially medieval island, but with a burgeoning and interesting art colony. Most everyone where, as art colonies tend to be, drunks or junkies, but a few of us actually managed to get some work done, even though we didn't drink any less than the other guys. But over the course of being in Ibiza, more long story, but I'll cut it short. A good friend of mine was a Dutch novelist, a very good one actually. I went to borrow some paper from my friend. Remember, this is a medieval island. There's only one place that sells paper, and it was a Sunday, and I ran out of paper. So I went to his place. We lived on the beach, right on the Mediterranean Sea. A little adobe. I had a little adobe, sort of like this, except without with the Mediterranean in front instead of the waterfalls. And the rule was, if you were actually trying to get some work done, that you didn't barge in. Nobody had telephones. There was no communication. That you didn't, just because you were feeling bored or depressed or you had writer's block, knock on somebody's door and expect them to treat you to, another gallon of wine. And so, very apologetically, Jan, I really need some paper. He said, okay. And he went and he got some paper for me, and I noticed on his desk, he had something going on in his desk. He had all of these pie charts divided into parts, like a pie. And when he came out, I said, what's that, Jan? And he said, you caught me. I don't tell people about this, but I'm an astrologer, and I do this. I do people's charts of celebrities in Holland to make some extra money. And I knew Jan well. We were good friends for a couple of years. He was a generation older than I was. He'd been a war hero in the resistance press during the Second World War. And I said, astrology? I said, oh, that's a bunch of bullshit, isn't it? And he looked at me square in the eye, big, tall, straight, looked like a retired British colonel. And he said, do you think I'm a fool? And I said, well, no, you're drunk, but you're not a fool. And he said, I've been studying this for about 20 years, and I tell you there's something to it. And my next question, of course, was, well, would you do my horoscope? And he said, no, get stuffed. Do your own. And he handed me a bunch of books. And since anything is easier than writing, I took them home and back to my place and spent the weekend trying to craft my own horoscope, and ended up with something that was botched. But there was enough in it. I was not very interested in the predictive side of astrology. I was interested in it for its number symbolism, and for its symbolism in general, and for the insistence by the astrologers that it was a sacred science that went much further back than it is credited with going back to. In other words, you go to a modern science class or a history class, and the subject of astrology comes up. Of course, your professor will sneer, and he will say, well, this is a Babylonian superstition that was made rational by the Greeks, but of course we know better, and it's all nonsense. I was intrigued by the notion that maybe it wasn't all nonsense. And then, over the course, so with my big mouth, my pal Jan managed to keep this secret for the years. By this time, we were 4 or 5 years in Ibiza, and he had not told people about this. But me, with my big mouth, I had to tell everybody. And then I got turned off the predictive side of it when it turned out, because everybody wanted their horoscope done, so that was good practice to do all of these things. The women all wanted to be told that they were going to meet a tall, dark, handsome stranger. And the men all wanted to be told that they were geniuses and were soon going to come into $1 million. And I realized that that's all they wanted to hear. And I said, nah, and I had no real talent for the predictive side of it anyway. Anyway, one of the people on Ibiza, not a close friend, but a friend, it was a cafe society, at some point, seeing my interest, vocal interest in astrology, said, I think there's a book that you ought to read. And he gave me a book called A Theory of Celestial Influence, who was written by a man named Rodney Collin. And this was really fascinating. This was a theory of why astrology could, should, and would work. Again, not necessarily as a predictive tool, but as a factor within the cosmos, within the cosmology. And it turned out that Colin was a pupil of Gurdjieff, of G.I. Gurdjieff. And gradually, my friend sort of led me into the Gurdjieff work, and which I've been in since that time. A lot of years have gone into the Gurdjieff work. And out of Gurdjieff is, I don't know how many people in your audience will know about him. You don't want to read Gurdjieff for yourself right off. It's like taking your first driving lesson in a Ferrari. But anybody who's interested, there's a book by one of his most gifted students named P.D. Ouspensky, Ouspensky, called In Search of the Miraculous, which is a good introduction to Gurdjieff's system. And effectively, what attracted me about Gurdjieff initially was that he was the only human being I'd ever read or encountered posthumously, he died in 1949, who was as contemptuous of Western civilization as I was. The difference was that he knew how to live in it, and I didn't. And it was very clear to me that I had to learn how to live in it, which I do now with relatively successfully. But anyhow, so that led me to the Gurdjieff work. Gurdjieff was talking all along about ancient Egypt and ancient civilizations in general being at a much higher and much more conscious level than our own. That fascinated me. And then we moved, my first wife who was an actress, Welsh actress, 1/8 Irish, and that was her name, Katie Dolan. And I'd been in the Visa 9 years, and it was time to get out. It was getting full of tourists, and it was time to go anyway. And I wanted to get in with one of the groups that was practicing this Gurdjieff system. And meanwhile, I had my novel published. I had a novel published called Osborne's Army, which one of these days I will republish, self-republish. It was almost a movie on several occasions. Big one almost. Didn't happen. Anyway, the editor of my novel was a Cambridge-trained mathematician, very opposite me in philosophically, atheist, rationalist, but we were nevertheless good friends. And one day the subject of astrology came up. We were having a jar in a pub one night, and the subject came up, and he said, "Oh, that's a bunch of codswallop." And I said, "Well, actually it isn't. It's a subject I know a lot about, and I could give you, if I bring in some documentation, I tell you could make, there's a lot of evidence, some of it, a little of it direct, but a lot of it indirect, and you could build a case for astrology." And he said, "Well, I'd like to see that." So I brought in the documentation, and he said, "I'm not convinced, but this is definitely interesting. Would you do a book on it?" And my answer is, a standard answer to a question like that is, "Yeah, I'll do a book on anything if you'll pay me some money." But it's not quite like that, but close. And so all of a sudden there I was having to do scholarship with a book called The Case for Astrology. And in doing, I was now in a Gurdjieff group, in doing the research for the astrology book, somebody directed me to a novel in 2 parts, 2-volume novel, called Herbak, Herbak. Herbak, 2 parts to it, and by a woman named Isha Shwala-Lubitsch. And so I got this book out. It had been translated from the French in the one esoteric bookstore in England at that time, still there, called Watkins, and started reading it, and it was horrible as a novel, but the portrait of Egypt that it painted, I don't know why people think it's easy to write a novel just because you're smart and have some good ideas. It's not that easy. Anyhow, it kept referring back to, in footnotes, it's strange to have footnotes in a novel, but lots and lots of footnotes, referring to a book called Le Temple de l'Homme, The Temple of Man, written by her husband, R.A. Schwaller-de-Lubicz, the genius with the unpronounceable name. And finally, I couldn't find this book, of course. I went to the British Museum, and sure enough, they had a copy which had never been read, because in those days, I think it's different now, French books don't have the signatures cut. So if you get a French book, you had to cut the signatures yourself, which is a sort of a rite of passage. It was sort of something viscerally satisfying about cutting the pages of a French book, and it was your book. There's Charlotte right behind me there somewhere. And anyway, before we were talking about this informed intuition, once I had those pages cut, I just sort of riffled through like this and realized that this guy had done something absolutely amazing. He had reformulated the sacred science of the ancients that everybody since the ancient Greeks had been talking about. And it's a complicated subject, but bits and pieces came down to us through alchemy and astrology and number symbolism and Neoplatonism and all of these other disciplines. They're always called the Hermetic sciences, or the Hermetic sciences, are they called? They're the Hermetic sciences?
Yes.
Yeah, sciences. But they've never been put together in a manner that is, let's say, accessible to our 21st century or then 20th century Western intellect. So I just drowned, and my French at this time was really entry level, but I just downed tools, and it was all the way the other side of London from where we lived. And every morning I'd go to the library, get there at opening time, and stay there with the dictionary by my side, fighting my way through this impenetrable book. Learning French along the way. It seemed like madness in retrospect. By the time I was done, I really understood Schwaller pretty well, and I included in the astrology book called The Case for Astrology, which we're about to republish as well, a long chapter devoted to Schwaller, which really didn't belong. I just felt this was so important, and it was not in English. Anyway, astrology book came out. Publishers came to me and said, "Would you do a book on Schwaller?" And I said, "Yeah, you bet," because this interested me more than the astrology, actually, which was, I found fascinating. But I was not a practicing astrologer, and I didn't see it was not a discipline. You couldn't use it anyhow, or you couldn't use it for your own inner work, let's say.
Right.
And so, in doing the research for The Serpent in the Sky, that book on Schwaller, on symbolist Egypt, I ran across, there was one long chapter where Schwaller's talking about the Egyptian insistence that their own civilization went thousands and thousands of years back further into the past. And Schwaller put together this scholarly argument, which was very well done, but it's not science. And at the end of this long chapter, came out with a single line that was, "Oh yes, and of course the great Sphinx of Giza shows unmistakable signs of aquatic erosion." And I realized, the penny dropped in the slot, and I realized that that was science, or that should be science. That's geology. Either it's water weathered or it's not water weathered. And I knew a little bit about it. I'm not a geologist, but I knew a little bit about geology, Egyptian geology, and I knew that the Sahara was a relatively new desert, 10,000 BC or so, and that if the Sphinx was really weathered by water, it had to have been carved at a time when there was a lot there, in one way or another. All of this is a lot more complicated than I'm
Right.
been able to get to, but anyway, you get the general drift of it. And so that started another long quest in which I had to track down, I had to do a lot of geological research, and there were enough signs along the way. So I went to see certain geologists and played a little trick on one of them. That's in The Mystery of the Sphinx, the Charlton Heston video that we did. Anyway, there was enough evidence there, so I was sure I was on the right track. And so when the book came out, in '79, I guess, it was basically ignored. And attempts to get geologists to verify my own research, they didn't want to talk to me. And eventually, through another weird set of circumstances, I got in touch with my colleague Robert Schock, who was about as highly credentialed a young geologist as a geologist could be. More long story, got him over to Egypt. The most cautious man in the world at getting a declarative sentence out of him was like pulling teeth with no Novocaine. And finally he said, "Well, yeah," he said, I can't refute this. Let's go for it. And we did a presentation at the GSA, that's the Geological Society of America annual meeting back in '91, I guess it was. And we were the GSA realized that this was a hot button issue. So we had press conferences, and all of a sudden this was really front page, front line, scientific thing all over the world. This is a big deal. And one side note here is worth telling. Schock used to not like me telling this, but I will tell it here, and since he now doesn't care. But we were being interviewed by the science press, by the mainstream press. The guy from Schock teaches geology at Boston University, still does, and the science editor of the Boston Globe called us up and wanted to interview us, and so Schock is his usual polite academic self, and when he got me on the phone, he said, "Well, why is it that the geologists seem very happy with this theory, and the Egyptologists and the archaeologists are hurling abuse at you?" And I said, "Well, this is a theory that's about weathering patterns in rocks, and when it comes to weathering patterns in rocks, an archaeologist's or an Egyptologist's opinion is no better than a proctologist's. And they published that, which did not put Shock in great thing with his colleagues. And one of a woman will go nameless here, one of his, a woman, archaeologist, Egyptologist, I think, or maybe both, archaeologist, Egyptologist, wrote this scathing, personal character assassination of Shock in the local Boston paper, Boston Journal, the BU Journal. And I said to Shock, you can't take this stuff, Shock. I mean, no. He said, no, let it be. It's done. I said, do you mind if I write her a letter, personally? I said, no, well, you go ahead. So I did, and I said, look, I understand your archaeology department is upset about this proctologist comparison. And I said, you should know the proctologists didn't like it either. They said their job was to cure sick assholes. They didn't like being compared to them. So this did not win me any friends in the Boston University archaeology department. And so it stands what is this now? Must be 90 or 91, so that's 25 years ago. Anyway, one thing led to the other, and all of a sudden there we had, again, all of this is a long story, but a very interesting one. All of a sudden there we had Charlton Heston as our host in The Mystery of the Sphinx, which was this huge, international, immense success that we managed to make no money out of, believe it or not. Partly because my partner in it was this wild man. Without him, it never would have happened, so I don't even hold it against him. But he stole $150,000 from the till, which did not help with our investors. And then we had to cut a contract with the TV company, with the distributors, which were in those days with Trimark, who are now incorporated into Lionsgate. And the contract was written. We knew that no matter how big a success it was, we'd never see a penny of it, which we didn't. But it put us all of us, it put us on the map. And so now we're all set to go, because we've been accumulating evidence ever since then. This is 25 years, and we now have loads of further evidence. And we're looking to do a major follow-up upgrade. Those aren't really the right words. It's a total. It's the original theory, but transformed into something much bigger, with the philosophy behind it and symbolist Egypt behind it, and all sorts of other things. So if anybody really rich is listening in and wants to support something that's actually going to change history around, because it will. The first one is still, people remember it all those years. We estimate that about probably at least a couple of 100 million people saw that original Mystery of the Sphinx.
And I believe
so that's where we now stand.
I believe it's on YouTube now.
Yeah, I think so.
So people can just look it up.
Pirate it, yeah. No, it's also on Netflix too.
Is it on Netflix?
Yeah, it's on Netflix.
Well, all right.
So you can actually pay a couple of dollars for it, and we get 3 cents.
Well, it's 3 more cents than if they get it on
If
YouTube.
they didn't, that's right.
Well, but actually,
you
I have a couple of things to add to what he had to say.
Please.
That, like a lot of people in this field, Serpent in the Sky was an entry point for me into studies about Egypt. What I didn't realize at the point that I read it was that it would come back around now to having cutting edge significance to the work that I had been doing. That one of the key links between new regions that I've been exploring and ancient Egypt and Africa lies with the idea of a building, a house, the form of a house in Neolithic times around 3200 BC, where the symbolism of the house relates to cosmology and is a central piece in linking the traditions together. This is like point A to what the Temple of Man would be point Z. Far less sophisticated, but it ties back to ancient mythology, ancient myths in India, ancient myths in Egypt, where cosmological symbolism is played out in relation to houses. There's a myth in India of about a goddess named Devi who visits 7 houses. And if you explore the plot line of the myth, as she arrives at each house, she finds a housewife in the house who's performing a particular act. And those acts, if you look up the ancient Egyptian word for what it is the housewife does, it's a homonym for a cosmological term. Each of these actions represent a stage of cosmology. There are 7 houses that relate to 7 stages of creation of matter. And the actions also relate to the personal needs of a person. If you have any familiarity with psychology, there are theories. Maslow, I think, had a theory of levels of personal need that had to be satisfied in a particular sequence. Well, this cosmology plays out in terms of those levels of need, but it also plays out in relation to phonetics that relate to the goddess Neith. And so, in the end, you see Neith as being a counterpart to this goddess Devi who visits the houses, and you understand that the symbolism of Neith relates to these levels of need. It's as if she were a household goddess. I haven't read anything that really explores origins for the goddess Neith, but this approach into it gives you a toehold into the possibility of explaining where Neith might have come from. You go to an Egyptian myth that's actually related in the Book of the Dead about a dead spirit who visits 7 houses, and you get into all sorts of very detailed information about cosmology. The spirit, instead of finding a housewife at each house, discovers 3 gods at each house. And those gods are performing certain actions and are in certain relationship to one another, and those relationships define cosmological concepts. So this, from my perspective, the concept of the Temple of Man is an evolved version of this very central symbolism that relates to the cosmology.
Okay, all right.
That's really interesting because in the Gurdjieff work, the symbol, the central symbol of the Gurdjieff work is called the Enneagram, which is a 7, which combines the 7 and the 3.
Right.
Actually, the 3 are the principles of positive, negative, and reconciling principles, and the 7, the thing in action in between, basically are the 7 stages of process,
Right.
which find expression again in the 7 days of creation, and 7 is always a number that is associated with process or growth.
Right.
So all of this stuff comes back to us now, and it's even by the standards of contemporary science apropos, except that it's much more complete, because the contemporary scientists are cosmologists for the most part, not all of them, some of them have a bit of a mystical sense to them, but for the most part they leave consciousness out of the equation.
Right.
And in the ancient myths, all of this is the result of consciousness deciding for reasons of its own to manifest.
Right. There are parallels in the processes of creation that include how consciousness emerges, and the idea that matter is multiple divisions of multiplicity that emerge from unity. Consciousness plays the same way, that consciousness are multiple divisions. Each individual is a division of unified consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So basically you're saying that matter arises from consciousness, not the other way around.
Yeah.
We're saying that the processes that create one are parallel to the processes that create the other, and maybe intertwined with the processes that create the other.
All right.
Okay. And Set in Egyptian, Set is the bad guy. They sometimes call him the god of evil. There's no such thing as a god of evil. If there's a god of evil, his name is Dick Cheney. But Set, according to Schwaller, Set is a great god who has to be worshipped as well. And Set is he who imprisons spirit in matter. So, in other words, spirit is essential to matter, but our job as human beings, and this here comes in Gurdjieff and all of the esoteric traditions that ever were, our job is to, through our own inner work, to free the spirit from the matter and make it no longer a slave to it. This is a very difficult thing to do, but that's the essence of it. So it's very useful, particularly when you go into the mythologies, various of them, and Laird has done this, in very in very sophisticated fashion to realize that all of them are talking about a certain kind of variations of the same inner discipline. In other words, what all of them are saying is that we're here for a reason. It's not, and that reason isn't accident or natural selection. It's that we're created with a job to do, which is to free the spirit from the matter.
Okay, all right. So let me throw you an easy question.
Okay.
How would you define reality?
Okay, well, the traditions I studied define reality as being an illusion.
Okay.
That reality is a reflected image. It's a shadow or a reflection of a reality that exists at a more fundamental level in the form of waves. According to the Dogen, our material reality is a correct reflection of that underlying reality. Some of the traditions don't think so. If you talk to an astrophysicist, there are random processes involved that mean that what we see might not look like what the underlying reality would be. But in my traditions, it is.
Okay. What about you? How would you define reality?
Well, it depends what you mean by reality. So, in other words, yes, that the material reality that we tend to accept as the only reality is, it's like Plato's myth of the cave, a reflection of the real reality, which is metaphysical. It is, back to Set again, it's reality is spirit. Spirit is consciousness. That's the ultimate reality. And then it takes all of these myriad forms in its myriad manifestations.
Okay.
But it's certainly not what, generally speaking, the Wall Street Journal called reality.
All right. All right. If we were to go back in time, how far back do you think advanced human cultures go?
Depends what you mean by advanced. You see, what's advanced?
Well, not necessarily advanced like us, but knowledgeable, as
Smartphones.
opposed.
Well, look, we now have. I mean, we've been talking about this for a long time, and everybody's been saying, "Oh, well, it's all hunter-gatherers back then for the Sphinx." We don't know when the Sphinx was built, carved ages ago. Göbekli Tepe is really important because it is the smoking gun. They, the archaeologists, date it to 10,000 at least, and as they keep on excavating, which is a very slow process, it keeps getting older rather than newer. I think they started excavating low, and probably when they keep going higher up this hill, they'll be getting older and still older dates. Laird, I think, has done a really good job because everybody's been talking about the relief work on it, all of these carving, and I think Laird has done a really solid job showing that that this is reflecting the same cosmological symbolism that they had in Egypt, but now we're talking about 10,000, 11,000 BC, so it's in place then. And this whole thing about hunter-gatherers is another kind of a barrel of red herrings, because the understanding is that, or let's say the party line is that hunter-gatherers are more primitive than farmers. Well, this is really stupid. I mean, if you can get your food, it's a lot more fun to go hunt and fish for your food than it is to hoe the earth and so on. Farming is really a step down. And in fact, you don't even need Göbekli Tepe. You have to go back to the Paleolithic caves. Now we're talking about 30,000 BC in Chauvet. This is genius work. I mean, this is how they did it is unbelievable. Presumably with their hands, this fabulous artwork on the walls of these caves, used how, what for. But the people, primitives, do not produce masterpieces, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
So the notion that these people before were really primitive comes from a peculiar position, actually. It comes from people who only know how to use their heads, and not very well at that. These are basically uncreative people who have never written an advertising jingle, much less a sonnet. and have certainly not painted a picture or designed a cathedral. And they're telling us that these past people who produced this genius work are primitive, and we with our hydrogen bombs and our striped toothpaste and our bobblehead dolls, we're progressive. It's exactly wrong.
Yeah, I always love the argument, where are the Coke bottles if there was an advanced civilization as well? Maybe they were more advanced than us.
Yeah, actually, this is the exact line people, Mark Lehner, the loyal opposition, who, when we had our thing after the GSA meeting, and there was a debate, so-called, at the AAAS, that's the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he was arguing from the hunter-gatherer point of view, and said, "Show me a potsherd." And my response was, well, it was such an advanced civilization, they used paper cups, so you wouldn't see a potsherd. Anyway, so that in other words, they don't understand what makes a civilization a civilization. For example, if the objective is to release the spirit from its prison of matter, then it doesn't matter if it's hunter-gatherers or whatever it is. For example, you can postulate, sacred dances around the world, everybody has, all the old civilizations have sacred dance. You could have a civilization of enlightened beings who express themselves through dance, and you'd never know a single thing about them. But it's that practice that determines where they are within themselves and how they pass their day. So you have to rethink the whole thing. Basically, everything that you've ever learned in school is probably wrong. Factually sometimes right, maybe, but it's trivial. Almost all of it is absolutely trivial. And in order to get to anywhere, I was lucky, I realized it was a bunch of bullshit from the very beginning, so I didn't learn too much. Not in school. I didn't accept what they taught me. But so you have to rethink all of these things, and now there are enough of us. This is the whole cottage industry. Laird is coming at it from the cosmological point of view. I come from the symbolist, from the esoteric side of things. Jacques is coming at it from a scientific point of view. But there are quite a number of us now, and we, unless it explodes before we get a chance to get our own numbers up to the state where we actually make a difference, at the moment we don't. We're a side issue. But you never know. The material is there to actually turn the whole thing around in principle.
Okay. Any thoughts on that?
Right. Well, one of the things John has pointed out before is that a lot of researchers come to these questions from a point of view of engineering. How did they lift the blocks into a pyramid? Or why did they build with larger blocks as opposed to smaller blocks? From an engineering standpoint, you can answer those questions in certain ways. But John points out what a markedly different effect it has on a person to be standing in a temple that's built from 700-ton blocks than to be standing in a building that was built from bricks. And so the question, the framework, the point of view from which you frame the questions makes a difference on what kind of an answer you come to about it. As far as technology as we understand it being progress, of being able to create flying machines and so forth, it only took a few thousand years for us to develop those. Mankind has been around long enough that could have happened many, 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 many times. And after 5,000 years, we wouldn't have a trace of it. So it's hard to argue that it hasn't happened before.
I found it interesting. They had done a show, I want to say it was called Life After People. And it had people, if everyone had disappeared from the earth at a certain point, what would be left in subsequent centuries? And pretty much by 10,000 years, everything was gone.
Right.
Aside from like the big dam we built in the Midwest, that was the only thing that would remain.
Right. If it wasn't carved in stone, we don't know about it.
Right. Exactly. And they even mentioned that on that dam is a cosmic map to tell us when it was built.
Yeah, but again, see, they're looking at it from a materialist point of view.
Right.
As I just said, you could have the highest civilization in the world doing nothing but gathering nuts and and running down deer, but practicing dances that put them in touch, that freed the spirit. Now, basically, it freed the spirit. I mean, in the Gurdjieff work, we have certain, what they call movements, which are unbelievably difficult to do, and I must say I'm pretty terrible at them. But every once in a while, you get it right, even if it's just momentarily, and suddenly you realize what it's like to free the spirit from the body, even if it's just momentary. And by extrapolating, you realize that people who can do that on a much higher level than ourselves are there all the time. I mean, I think some of the Tibetan lamas and the Indian gurus and people that the saints of Christianity got there through their own inner work. And it's very difficult to do that in this corrupted society of ours.
What do you think about the concept of golden ages and such being related to levels of consciousness that we're in?
I absolutely believe in it. But the specifics are very mysterious, and everybody has a different view of it. When you go to Egypt, I mean, I do these Egypt trips all the time. I have 4 of them or so a year. And at the end of those 2 weeks, Egypt seen through symbolist eyes, you really understand. I often start lectures out by saying, Egypt is like sex, and that gets everyone's attention. But it really is, because in the sense that you can read about it, and that's intellectually invigorating, perhaps, and then you can look at pictures, and that's the kind of invigoration, but you don't actually understand it until you've experienced it. Not at all. So when you spend a couple of weeks in Egypt with one masterpiece after another, day after day after day, at the end of a couple of weeks you understand the difference between what was actually civilization and what we call progress. And when you get that, when that lesson sinks in, then the yugas come into play, because you see that these unbelievable, it's only in Egypt that there's so much left that you can experience it. Other places have a bit of it here, a bit of it there, but Egypt has lots of it. Then you see, if you try to extrapolate, that we, with our mindset, couldn't produce one of these temples. We couldn't produce the least of those temples. It's so alien to our way of thinking. We couldn't do it. We wouldn't know how to do it. And yet, when you go into them, even if in ruins, I mean, people break down and cry. They have these profound emotional experiences. We can get this to a certain extent. Still, in certain classical, Bach gets there, and Monteverdi gets there, and Beethoven gets there. We have pieces of it that take us there. But in Egypt, we don't have any buildings that take us there. We are actually immersed in the midst of the symphony. And so this is and you can't convey that. I mean, we got a video going here, but it's not going to produce the effect of the Temple of Luxor or the Philae Temple or anything of the sort. But it's there, and when you can get some of it from, as I said, from reading, and some of it from good videos. There are good shows out there.
But you can't feel it.
But it's not the same as being there.
Okay. Any thoughts?
What he said.
How did you feel when Göbekli Tepe came out?
I said, oh, well, I guess this is it. It makes me feel, when it comes to see my colleagues, for the most part, Laird doesn't feel the same way that I do. Graham Hancock and the others, they're not really out to murder the opposition. The skeptics often say, they're not skeptics, they're debunkers. If you want to convince skeptics, I don't want to convince skeptics, I want to destroy them. So when Göbekli Tepe came out, put it this way, it made me feel the way I imagine a cannibal chieftain must feel watching a boatload of missionaries approach. This is the smoking gun, because they date it to that day, and once they've done that, they can no longer say that anything is impossible, that any of these amazing things, can't be older than they say they are, because there they have it. And then there's a ton of ancillary evidence. If you go to Egypt, and you see the so-called solar boat. This is the best boat up to the clipper ships. They could have gone anywhere with that boat, Australia, New Zealand, Antarctica. They could go anywhere with this fantastic boat. So there's no reason why they couldn't, and much earlier, I mean, this is 2500 BC, but you see pre-dynastic pictures of boats that look like the same form of boat. They can go anywhere with these boats, and if they know how to navigate, and since they hadn't advanced astronomy, they could navigate. So all of these things are not necessarily answered by Göbekli Tepe, but it means that they can no longer use the bullshit rationalizations that they have been using for all of these years to shoot the theories down.
Okay. It is sort of the pottery shards.
Yep, it is big pottery shards, 12-ton pottery shards.
And your thoughts on it?
Well, I think that the farther back in time you go, the trickier it gets to try to do what I call anchoring interpretations. One of the standards I have for myself is that I try to base interpretations on flat statements by the cultures I'm studying. In other words, it's not that I think it means such and such, it's that the Egyptians say here in this text it means such and such, and find other cultures that have the same practice or the same symbol who saw it the same way. And now you have a place to start from that's solid. If you go back before 3000 BC, you lose written texts. And without the written text, it becomes a much more interesting process to try to anchor an interpretation. Göbekli Tepe gives us lots of really interesting structure to work with, and carvings to work with, and symbolism to work with, but in a context where there are not traditional ways to anchor it. And so part of my work has been trying to make linkage in ways that seem sensible to people. Language, as it turns out, in the absence of writing, is a very useful tool for being able to do that, because words evolved in particular ways with particular cultures, and important words tend to stay in the language of a culture for a very long time. And so if you can demonstrate what a word means for various cultures, you can infer what the word meant for an earlier culture. That has been one of my approaches.
All right. So let's talk about some of the new evidence coming to light. Places like Gadang Padang. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, I think. I mean, my Indonesian is rather weak these days, but I have a southern accent, you know.
So you haven't been there yet?
No, but Shock has.
Okay, and what are your thoughts on the place?
Well, I mirror Shock. I mean, left to my own devices, I wouldn't know what to make of it. But he is, as we know, both very expert in these matters and very cautious. And he is cautiously convinced that it is indeed an artificial structure, even though you can't determine the structure. It has something to do with these, I'm not sure if they're basalt formations that should be vertical and that are horizontal. And if they're horizontal, it means that they've been put there. Whereas if they're vertical, the way they extrude from the earth. This could be, I mean, I may only be 10% correct, but the 10% is important. And so Shock has spent a few days there with the guy who's the Indonesian geologist who's been battling his own academic colleagues to get them to acknowledge that this thing really is a lot older than whenever it's supposed to be. I don't know.
Yeah, which is only like 2,000 years or something.
Something like that. That it has to be much, much older than that. And Shock thinks, again, to being a very cautious guy, that talking about 20,000 or more years BC.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but I can't speak from experience, but I'll take his word as let's say, the most authoritative that we have to date.
And that whole area would have been one large continent back 20,000 years ago.
Well,
So,
yeah.
do you have any thoughts on it?
I haven't studied it. The traditions that I connect Göbekli Tepe forward through exerted influences all through Southeast Asia as far as Australia. they're traditionally understood to have exerted influences that far. So my expectation is that anywhere in there we're going to find things that connect to what I'm looking into. I don't have an opinion as to that site or how old it might actually be. There are symbolic indications along the way from starting from 10,000 BC and moving forward. There are I have enough of an overview of enough different cultures to realize that certain elements fit in certain places in that timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if I were more familiar with it, I could probably place certain things. In broad strokes, if they know if it was a matriarchal or patriarchal culture, you can pinpoint time frames based just on that.
Okay. Age.
How?
How?
Yeah,
Because
just matriarchal.
there are cross cultural reversals that happen around 3000 BC. That what was
Yeah.
matriarchal became patriarchal.
Oh, really?
And the Maori show it perfectly, that there's a perfect flip of, and you can show it through the language, that words that in the earlier cultures referred to matriarchal things, the god Tanapenu becomes Tain in the Maori culture.
Mm-hmm.
Things that are assigned to Tanapenu in the matriarchal culture get assigned to Tain in the later
Really?
patriarchy.
Yeah.
Osiris's myth, the myth of the dismemberment of Osiris,
Right.
is a story that's told about Sati, a goddess in India. She
Yeah.
was dismembered, and her body parts fell to earth as pithas, standing stones that defined the ritual centers.
Really?
Yeah. So so part of the way I judge is it matriarchal or patriarchal? If it's patriarchal, it's after 3000 BC.
Ah.
Why do you think there was a sudden shift around that time period everywhere?
It's not just that. There are all sorts of other reversals that happen in the cosmology too. Ganesha is a good example. That there are lots of signs. Mythically, Ganesha's head, the white elephant, was not his original head.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Okay. Now there are not surviving myths that tell you what the original head was, but the language points to it having been the head of a mouse. And in Egypt, there's an archaic shrew mouse god whose symbolism connects in certain ways. The problem is that from a cosmological standpoint, you have the symbolism relating to an astronomic structure, which is a macrocosmic structure, that intuitively should be associated with a large animal, not a small one. The reversal accomplishes that, and you see that happening again and again, where there are little tweaks and little adjustments to the system of cosmology to put the symbols in line with the things they represent to make it more intuitive. Now, as far as the matriarchy-patriarchy goes, my feeling is this connects to things like circumcision. Circumcision is, in my estimation, is a perfect way to get the people who were influenced by the tradition to tag themselves. If you come across a culture that circumcises, that's a signature of the tradition I'm chasing. You can tell immediately there was an influence there. The matriarchy-patriarchy distinguishes what looks to me to have been instruction at 10,000 BC is given in relation to the matriarchy. Later instruction was given in relation to the patriarchy. If you were trying if you had developed a plan of study and you wanted to know, now, which course did I teach had the beneficial effect on the students, which one succeeded, you'd want ways to be able to track that. And the matriarchy-patriarchy flip allows you to do that.
Wow. Okay. My next question to you, I think, is how old are the pyramids?
Impossible to say. What we see now is probably mostly accurate, 2500 BC or so. But demonstrably, without any question, they are built upon or superimposed or replace structures that were there before. Even the academics believe, Laird principally, that the whole Giza Plateau is one sort of unified field pyramid plan. So everything was planned. Nothing was wasn't that Khufu did this, and then Khafra came around and said, well, line mine up so that it goes straight through, and then the third guy, Menkaura, comes along and says, well, I don't have as much money as those guys, so I'm going to put mine a little way off to the side so they don't think I'm trying to compete. No, it's all of a piece. And the Khafra pyramid, particularly the Menkaura pyramid to a certain extent, the Red Pyramid and Dashur definitely have elements within them visible that have to date from another period, because whenever you see two different architectural styles incorporated in the same structure, you know you're talking about two different time periods. If you go to your friend's house and he's got this beautiful Victorian house, but it's got an IKEA designed bathroom, you know that suddenly, boy, this is a smart Victorian architect who figured out how to have this IKEA designed bathroom. No, I'm saying you saw medieval, let's say you have a Georgian Palladian house or in England, 18th century, and it's got a medieval turret incorporated in it. It's not that this guy said, well, shoo, I like medieval stuff, let's put a turret in my thing. No, it said it was a turret on his property, and he said, oh, well, let's have some fun, we'll build our manor house around it. So this is absolutely clear, unmistakable in the Khafra pyramid, slightly less unmistakable in the Menkaura pyramid, the smallest one. The Great Pyramid, more difficult, but Chuck and I are working on this. We think we can put forward a good argument that even that, though it seems to be of a piece from the outside, is incorporating still earlier stages in it. The Red Pyramid at Dashur is unmistakably built over and incorporating an earlier and weathered megalithic construction of some sort. So, answer to question, what we see is Old Kingdom Egypt, but incorporated within it are at least a stage, but probably stages of earlier construction.
Okay, and what do you think the pyramids were for?
I don't know any more than anyone else. What I know they weren't for is tombs.
Okay, any thoughts on that, Laird?
There are as many theories about what they're for as there are books out there.
Yeah.
Pretty much. That's anybody's guess about that. But it's more certain the kinds of things that they symbolize and what they relate to. They relate to aligned ritual shrines that date back a very long way, starting with cairns, stone cairns have the same symbolism. You see the same symbolism in a huppah from a Jewish wedding ceremony. You see the same symbolism associated with a sukkah in Judaism. You see the same thing in a yurt in Siberia. You see the same thing in a roundhouse for the Navajo. The symbolism relates to the structure. So whether the pyramids had more sophisticated technological purposes or not is anybody's guess.
Okay, all right.
Actually, one thing in here, there was a typically dismissive video program a few years back. I don't know if it's Discover or National Pornographic or one of those guys. And anyway, they were talking about the pyramids, and they were calling them wink, wink, nod, nod, immortality machines. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly right, except you have to take out the wink, wink, nod, nod. Egypt is a one-issue civilization. It's very easy to understand in that sense. It manifests itself with extreme complexity, but it has one focus, and that is the quest for immortality. That's what every religious anything in Egypt is about in one way or another. And of course, in quackademia, you never ever hear, other than saying, well, the Egyptians knew how to move 200-ton stones around easily, but you never ever hear them say the Egyptians knew. It's always the Egyptians believe. The Egyptians believe this, the Egyptians believe that. This doesn't agree with us, and we know better. But maybe they actually knew, since they built these things that we couldn't possibly emulate today. And it's a pretty safe guess that whatever their function was, it was in order to further this idea or this concept or this decision to become immortal, which does not mean that the body lives forever. It means that a level of consciousness is attained that is not subject to, or that outlives forever the corruptible flesh of the body.
And how come they had such a fascination with mummification if the goal was to leave the material world?
Very good question. The only thing I've ever read that makes any sense, because there's something pretty repugnant about that. According to Schwaller, Egypt was, the Egyptian doctrine intertwined the let's say the path of Horus, which becomes Christianity, salvation within a single lifetime, with the path of Osiris, which is that of successive reincarnations, similar to Buddhism and Hinduism. And it's very difficult to try to disassociate one from the other. According to Manly Hall, and I don't know where he gets it from, but he was quite a brilliant guy. He said that the understanding was, again, the quackademics would say, they believed. I don't know I forget what language Manly Hall used, but that the reason for going to that incredible amount of trouble to mummify a body so that it would never decay was that as long as the physical body remained, the disembodied ka, or you might say soul, of the deceased would not be obliged to reincarnate. In other words, he could take his time about it. The Tibetans, for example, have that idea with their Book of the Dead, where the 49 days, the Lama goes through this long rituals. I don't know if you've ever read it. You probably have.
I have.
Starts out, it's all like paradise, and then it gets worse and worse and worse, and the Lama keeps saying, well, don't be afraid, this is just your mind projecting this kind of stuff, and keeps getting worse and worse and worse, and finally the Lama says, well, the whole idea is not to come back. And the Lama says, well, you goofed it up, you're going to have to come back. Better luck next time. So something of that nature, Hall doesn't use that kind of language, but that to me made sense, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. And I'm inclined to believe that whatever the Egyptians did, they're doing for some good reason. Just
Right.
like everything that we do has a good reason, but most of the good reason is to kill people or make money.
Right.
So this puts a different sort of focus upon the entire civilization.
Thoughts?
From a cosmological perspective, when you're creating the fundamental unit of matter, according to the traditions I'm studying, what you're doing is you're creating a wrapped up bundle that's akin to wrapping cloth around a mummy. And the final stage of it is that, it's hard to explain this, another way of looking at the structure is as 7 rays of a star of increasing length inside of a bubble. And the 7th ray grows long enough that the very final thing that happens to that bubble is that the final ray grows long enough to pop it, to burst it. And that initiates the next bubble. Now, if you mummify somebody by wrapping them up in that way, and the final stage is to open the mouth, it's repeating a sequence that looks cosmological to me. And the product of doing that is you've completed the previous bubble, and you're initiating the next one. So there could be easily be a connection to the idea of completion of the previous life and the initiating the action that starts the next one.
Isn't it also possible that some of this stuff was lost? Like they started doing it for one reason, and over time, just were doing it for the sake of doing it because they lost the theme?
I don't think so. I think that except very, very late in Egypt, there's some signs that the reasons for doing things might have started to be lost, but for the most part, I think they knew exactly what they were doing.
Okay.
Well, I'm not so sure, because in the texts themselves of the New Kingdom pyramid texts, the scribes who are putting them down are copying older texts, and they're saying they're saying, well, we don't know exactly.
But that
what
could be
came.
true. By the time of the New Kingdom, I'd say you're right. But
Yeah, well, it's not. That's not
right,
that
that's
much
not
later.
that's not that.
But actually, what you were saying, Laird, that's very interesting because it's not contradictory. But when Schwaller talks about mummification as, I mean, the mummified body is a cocoon,
Right.
and it looks exactly like the cocoon of a scarab beetle. So, but it's the same thing. I mean, on the human level, as you're talking about cosmologically,
Right.
that it goes through all of these stages exactly like fertilization, like that which a butterfly goes through, or even a human fetus. It gets quickened, and it goes through the stage, and then it goes to the next stage, and then it's born.
Right.
So, the whole idea is, particularly if it's a reincarnational thing, is that it's reborn, but through that that process of metamorphosis.
Right.
So it's really the same, except your
Right.
description is cosmology, and mine is.
Right. And if we understand that those processes were thought of as being parallel, then
Yeah.
then it can make sense.
Yeah, it makes absolutely.
All right. How come we never hear about what's inside the smaller two pyramids on the Giza Plateau? Everyone focuses on the Great Pyramid.
Well, they do, but one of the reasons is that there's nothing inside except a couple of chambers that nobody understands. But yeah, it's true, and in fact, I don't know either, but both of the interior chambers of both of those pyramids is a good argument for being built in several stages, because there are certain blind alleys and strange shifts of where the passages are going that absolutely don't make any sense. I mean, they certainly don't make any sense as tombs, but they also don't make any sense architecturally, and they feel it's hard to explain. If we're there, we can go in and you can see, well, why the devil are they doing this way when they've got this passage over here? So, and they don't, and it's really my own conviction is that if anyone ever really figures out what the pyramids are for, it's going to be because the Great Pyramid takes 95% of the attention, and in fact, I think there's a grand pyramid plan that they all fit into, and that to understand any one of them, you have to understand what all of them do. Cosmological, astronomical, astrological, I'm not sure, but my sense of it is that it has something to do with that. Okay. So far, no one's come up with anything that I know of that's convincing for all of them.
Okay. Anything?
On one level, there are multiple levels of symbolism involved. Now, on one level, a very simple level, they represent stars. The Dogon place large stones on a plateau to represent stars that are important in their cosmology, and including the belt stars of Orion. And the reason they place the stones that relate to the belt stars of Orion, they say, is to point us to an astronomic structure called Barnard's Loop. There's a birthplace of stars, it's a spiral, in the macrocosm that centers on the belt stars of Orion. You can't see it with the naked eye, but you can image it with time-lapse photography. And the Dogon say the reason why that's important is because it's the macrocosmic correlate to the little egg of the world I was talking about. That's the spiral of matter, the structure, that's the basic structure of matter. And if you think of the Hermetic theme of as above, so below, these are the structures that you can correlate as above, the processes above to the processes below with. That's why the Dogon say it's important. So on that level, the pyramids represent stars. But the levels of symbolism in Dogon cosmology are described like layers of skin on an onion. You peel one back and you find another one. So you can't just say it represents one thing. From this perspective, it represents a star.
Okay.
Yeah, so far, I think that too, but so far nothing obvious has come forward. I mean, at first I used to think that there was the planetary system, but that doesn't seem to apply.
No. There are reasons why the pyramids are as massive as they are, and that may relate
Some
to
reason,
it.
yeah.
And there are reasons why they were made out of often made out of materials that conduct electricity in
Or
ways.
anyway, the interior is, yeah. Oh, yeah, that's the reason for all
And
of
there are
that.
reasons why they have acoustic properties
Yep.
but what those are.
Yeah,
it
we
was
don't know,
good.
right. They knew more about certain things than us.
Right.
I mean, they didn't have smartphones or McDonald's or no bobblehead dolls in ancient Egypt.
Actually, there is a theory that says there was a McDonald's inside the king's chamber.
What are your thoughts? It could be a consciousness-altering machine.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah. That's just what I was talking before, but that they're immortality machines, and immortality,
One
the
of the
whole notion of immortality is a higher level of consciousness that you have to work to get to.
One of the key differences in the philosophies I deal with between the non-material and the material has to do with massiveness, differences in massiveness. And Einstein's, his formula E equals mc squared has to do with, it explains why the speed of light is a constant. And basically what it boils down to is that as a body becomes more massive, its time frame goes down. And so the speed of light remains the same in relation to it. Massiveness and acceleration are equivalent. So when you get down to matter at the level of waves, where it's virtually massless, you've got to believe that the time frame is almost instantaneous. So the relative mass of something has a connection to connecting non-materialism to materialism. And so my guess is that's part of why they went to such trouble to use such massive blocks to build like the Great Pyramid.
Okay. What other evidence has popped up recently that supports the basic Sphinx idea that it's an ancient structure?
Well, we have a ton of it actually. We presented this, in fact, a second time at a GSA in Reno in 2000 with a whole bunch of packed house of geologists, all but two of whom agreed with us. And unfortunately, we didn't realize this at the time. The first time we had a poster presentation, so everybody could come around and schmooze and discuss things and all of that. And this one was an oral presentation, which Shock gave, because I don't have the letters after my name, so I can't do these things. But it was short, 20 minutes or so, which is not enough time, as you see, to get into these things in depth. And but basically successful. There's a ton of other evidence that we have all collected of other instances of water weathering, of other things that are anomalous, of other kinds of structures in Egypt itself, and that's not taking in Göbekli Tepe, or there are other places also that we think have been wrongly dated. Sardinia, for example, which is one of the world's best kept megalithic secrets and unbelievable.
Where's that?
Sardinia.
Where?
Sardinia.
Okay.
Sardinia off the coast of Italy, which everyone thinks is where they invented sardines, but it has nothing to do with sardines.
Huh? And what's there?
These extraordinary things that look like gigantic. They're not pyramids, but they're megalithic, built of rough stones, like huge beehives, 8 stories high.
Oh wow!
And Shock thinks we're thinking that because Shock is really into this whole theory of CMEs, coronary mass ejections,
Right.
as being the reason that the whole thing fell apart around 9,700 BC. And he's been working with the petroglyphs, and if you've interviewed him, you've got a lot of information on that. And we think that these Sardinian things, he hasn't seen them yet, but I have, could be built as structures to protect you from one of these CMEs. Might be built later on, I don't know.
Like some of the underground cities in Turkey.
Well, maybe. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there. This is a very interesting field to get into as long as you don't have a PhD in it.
All right, let me throw you this question.
Can I address this?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, well, if you believe that the three pyramids point to the belt star of Orion at 10,000 BC, and the Sphinx was meant to point to Leo, the constellation of Leo, at around 10,000 BC, then you really only have two choices. One is that at least the alignments for those structures were done at 10,000 BC, If you don't buy that, then you have to buy that some later culture had the ability to retrospectively calculate what the alignment should have been. So that's a start. The second thing is that the Sphinx is carved from a natural outcropping of stone. It's an animal figure carved from a natural outcropping of stone. That's one of the signatures of the archaic cult that I connect back to Göbekli Tepe. That's something they did. They carved things, made statues out of natural outcroppings. So stylistically, it's a 10,000 BC era structure.
Okay.
So that doesn't say that it was built then, but as John was saying about styles of architecture, we have something stylistically here that looks like it connects, and symbolically it could connect. So just a consideration.
I think I'm not happy with that 10,500 date, in part because it's in the middle of these two gigantic, the Younger Dryas, the thing that happens, whatever it is, 10,800, probably a comet thing, and the 9,700 coronary mass ejection. I'm more inclined to think that Shock is now getting around to this point too. The Egyptians themselves in the Palermo stone and the Turin papyrus are giving the regnal years of these divine and semi-divine rulers, and this is pushing it back to around 36,000 BC. And that's it. In other words, if the Sphinx is meant as a Leo marker, and there's plenty of evidence that the zodiac was known, this is, what's his name, the Santayana and Von Deck and Hamlet's Mill.
Right.
I'm more inclined to think it's an earlier processional age rather than the 10,500
Right.
one.
And there's nothing that I know about that precludes that from being true.
Right.
That could be true.
And actually, again, this thing we were talking about before of informed intuition, when Shock first went into, now it's okay, but when we first got permission, and I don't even remember if we actually had permission or we bribed our way into the Sphinx enclosure. I hope that we bribed our way in because it's a better story. But we went in there, and Shock really didn't know anything about this. He'd read my own evidence and things like that. But we walked in early in the morning, nobody was there, and he just looked. Everybody else is, gobsmacked, as they say in England, by the Sphinx itself. Shock is looking at rocks. He's a geologist, and he's looking at the enclosure wall where it has this, 15 feet of weathering in it. And he looked at it and he said, "Wow." He said, "These rocks look like they're hundreds of thousands of years old." And he said, "Don't quote me on that," which I didn't do. But really, when we're talking about informed intuition, he's a geologist. My informed intuition on geology is nil. I couldn't put a date to it or even a provisional date to it. But his informed intuition is very interesting. It might be even a lot older than that 10,000 date.
Right. Could be.
And then, of course,
And
the further along you go, the more destroyed everything gets.
And that's right. And the Ice Age presents an obstacle to evidence that's hard to get past.
Yeah.
And so you were mentioning the end of the Ice Age. You think a comet created the Younger Dryas?
Well, the Younger Dryas intensifies the Ice Age.
Right.
Well, this is the theory. It's not my theory, but it seems Shock is into this. There's a fair amount of, I don't have it in my head at the moment. There seems to be a fair amount of substantiated evidence, and I think the evidence that it's a coronary mass ejection at around 9700 BC that puts an end to the Ice Age, that looks pretty good to me. And Shock and I were in Norway last year around when summer. You never know, it was summer in Norway. It could have been February here. and we went looking at these extraordinary petroglyphs where they have, about those. Did Shock talk about those on your program?
Yep.
So the petroglyphs, which are all over the world, are these same weird figures that come out of, that people see when there's a
Plasma
when there's
discharge.
a CME, these plasma structures, whereas everything else is quite recognizable. And it's reindeer and reindeer in Norway, and it's giraffes in Africa. But wherever the petroglyphs are, they have these bizarre CME
Shapes.
Big shapes.
Yeah, they're plasma discharges.
Exactly.
I've had Wallace Thornhill on talking about it before, and he said that the only ones that don't show up are the ones that would have killed somebody. You know, if you see them, you're dead.
Well, maybe.
That's true.
But they think it was actually Venus using Velikovsky's theory. They think that maybe Venus came through much earlier, and that's what ended the ice age, and that was the plasma discharge as Venus came close.
Yeah, I don't have anything to say that would be true, but
Okay.
I mean,
That's Talbot and
Thornhill?
I think it's mostly Talbot and Thornhill. I think it's more David Talbot who thinks that. But
Would that give you such a thing? Would that give you?
according to their theory, it would.
Really?
Yeah, because the planets wouldn't actually collide; they would exchange what they call thunderbolts of the gods,
Right.
Right.
which are
Yeah.
giant plasma discharges.
right.
I never heard that, but that's ballparking it. That doesn't sound
Yeah.
illogical to me.
And I mean, you've done the work on Velikovsky's theory to say that Venus definitely seemed to be a comet at some point in its history.
Right, right. And actually, they have examples in exosolar systems of planets that have comets' tails that start out as comets. So they know it can happen for sure.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah,
Interesting.
Yeah. Also, they have examples of large gas planets producing rocky, more Earth-like planets, although larger. But they have one case where two large rocky planets. The official theory is it was formed from a gas giant. So we know we can do that also.
So again, Velikovsky gets
Right.
some validation.
Right. Now, as far as the covering over of Göbekli Tepe when it happened, I now have things to compare that to that event to because I have a second site that was deliberately covered.
What's that?
But when they covered it, they left symbolic messages as to why they covered it.
And what site is that?
This is a site in northern Scotland. I have a book coming out that's at the publisher right now. I'm calling The Overthrown Boat. And when the site was covered, there was a huge feast just before the site was deliberately abandoned, ostensibly to kill the domesticated animals they had there rather than leaving them to starve. And after the feast was over, there were probably 1,000 animals killed at this feast. They left only shin bones all around the feast site, covered it over with an intact deer carcass, and placed the head of a bull on top of it, or a cow on top of it. Now, the act of covering it over, okay, the series of megalithic sites in northern Scotland that I'm exploring are progressive stages of how matter is created. You have a series of sites that reflect progressive stages of how matter is created, and the Dogon word for that is arc, and there's an equivalent Egyptian word that means spiral that is pronounced arc. But the word arc also means to cover over. And so by covering over the site, what they've done is named it. The shin bones are pronounced like a word that means to leave in under duress or under distress. There are other word examples that connect to the symbols they left that explain why they covered it over. Now, in Judaism, what happens is every day, every temple in the world, every Jewish temple in the world reads the same portion of a Torah scroll. And when they're done, it's an instructional session. And when they're done, they roll up the scroll, carefully cover it over, and place it back in its cabinet, which is called an ark. It looks to me as if the process of covering over these sites was that kind of a ritual. It was saying, here we have a site that had an instructional purpose. When its purpose was complete, we covered it and we placed it back and named it as an ark.
Okay.
Now, what's also interesting is the site in northern Scotland, the archaic name for it was Argat. Ar is a phonetic value that means ascending stages, and Gat is a word that means gates. At Göbekli Tepe, you have an ark that was covered over. Ar, if you again assume, means ascending stages of matter. There's another Egyptian word that refers to the individual stages of that, the gates of that. It's pronounced Erit. And so you have a word, Ar-Arit, or Ararat, as the name. And Göbekli Tepe is located a very short distance from Ararat. So the naming of the site implies ascending stages of matter.
Okay. Wow. Your next book's going to be something, isn't it?
Well, the next one coming on, I'm happy with the next one. The one about northern Scotland took me places I didn't expect it to go, and that a lot of people won't be very happy about.
Why is
Who won't
that?
be happy?
And pretty much anybody.
Why?
Okay.
I'm okay.
Okay, the book started with a single question from a Facebook friend who was in Australia, wondering if there could have been Egyptian influences on Orkney Island in northern Scotland. And I knew nothing about it, so I explored the idea, and there's very little evidence there. It's all structural and symbolic, but it's before written language. It's 3200 BC. But I knew that at 3200 BC, I considered the Dogon to have been Egyptian at that time. The evidence points to close involvement between the two in that era. So, since the Dogon have done such a good job of preserving their culture, I thought I might be able to find commonalities between Orkney Island and the Dogon, expecting that the influences went from Egypt or Africa to Orkney Island. When I got to the Orkney Island site, examining the things there, one of the things is a structure of a house that was repeatedly built on Orkney Island. There are 8 houses built to the same original plan. And that structure has a unique feature, or what the researchers in Scotland are calling a unique feature. It's a beehive-shaped room. It's a round room attached to some other rooms that are rectangular in size and a doorway at the far end. Well, it turns out the plan of the house is a match for the typical plan of a Dogon house, stone house, but the Dogon plan has cosmology associated with it. This is the shape of a woman's body. The round room is her head. 2 long rectangular rooms are her arms. The central cavity is her body cavity. In the center is a hearth, and down at the end are her sexual parts, which is the doorway. Now, in the Dogon version of the house, it's the same plan. The problem is there's no hearth. And so I thought it's very interesting that, on Orkney Island, when they implemented the plan and they added the hearth, they did it in a way that was cosmologically sound. They added the hearth where the heart should be. It was a while before I realized that I had it backwards, that the Orkney Island house was the original house, and the Dogon, when they took it to the desert, didn't need a hearth, and they removed the hearth. Now you go to ancient Egypt, and the earliest burial chambers in Egypt take the same shape. I have an example of a burial chamber in Egypt. Now, it's understood that mastabas and things like that were supposed to represent houses. This early burial chamber takes the same plan as the Dogon and the Orkney Island house. So the presumption is it had the same symbolism. It looks to me as if what we have on Orkney Island is a life-sized instructional sanctuary that a person could walk through the stages of matter to learn about them. And the stages culminate, or seem to culminate, with 8 chambered houses at Skara Brae on Orkney Island, which is a little farming village, which represent this cluster of chambers that are the egg of the world, the fundamental structure of matter. Turns out Dogon cosmology takes it one stage further. The next stage involves an agricultural field that was used to represent what in science is called the background field that particles form against. And every year, the Dogon create a drawing in the field of their high priest called the priest of Aru that represents these fundamental particles and the fundamental vibrations of matter. The Egyptians have a similar concept called the word one Egyptian word for field is Sekhet, and their term is pronounced Sekhet Eru, and but it's interpreted in Egypt as being the field of reeds. But the term field of reeds is an alternate term for what by ancient Greek times was called the Elysian fields. You go to ancient Greece, and the Greek writers write about the Elysian fields the same way the Dogon talk about this field that has cosmological meaning for them. It's an actual agricultural field in real life that the Dogon use and cultivate, but it also is a cosmological concept, so it exists on 2 levels at once. You go to Greece, you have writings about the Elysian Fields as if it were a real geographic place, and all the geography they describes Orkney Island. It's right. It's the right location. It's the right climate described. It's the right circumstance for the island described. It's ostensibly a place where agriculture happened. So what you've got is a potential link to this concept of the field, the second Eru or the field of Eru, that links back to Orkney Island, that has symbolic ties to ancient Egypt in the earliest dynastic times. It looks to me as if what might have been happening on Orkney Island was they were training people to establish kingships based on agriculture.
Well, all right.
Okay, nobody's going to like that, but that's where
I don't mind.
definitely.
No, I think it's fascinating. I mean, well, and what are your thoughts on it?
I don't have any. Listening to Laird, actually, it's just strange. In fact, like as you're talking, I remember I was at a conference in Italy somewhere with Graham and Schock, and I think Boval was there, and there was an Italian guy talking about the Odyssey, and saying that this is taking place in Norway, or because the topography was completely inconsistent with Mediterranean, but it seemed to fit rather well in that northern,
Right.
that those northern areas, and I thought I was pretty impressed by it. I thought that was really very, very interesting, and as we know, I mean, there's enough stuff around now that you don't dismiss things because the dating seems to be
No.
incompatible with standard dating, since they've got it all wrong anyhow. It could be, the whole thing has to be rethought in terms of its, not so much its symbolic value, but its physical value. I mean, the Orkney Islands are really
Interesting
not,
places.
not exactly, I mean, I haven't been there, but
No.
I mean,
it's really interesting. Now, another.
you went there.
No, I haven't been
Oh,
there,
you
but
haven't.
it's an interesting thing that at 10,000 BC, at places like Göbekli Tepe, you have high mountaintop sanctuaries that serve. That if you imagine there was someone who knew science, who, as the Dogon and the Buddhists are claiming, passed instruction to humanity about civilizing skills in those days, the high mountain top sanctuary provides a safe haven for the teachers. It's high enough up that we couldn't, as hunter-gatherers, couldn't get at them. So the first thing I asked myself about the Orkney Island site is, if there were teachers there, and the linguistics makes it look like there were, where was their safe haven? Orkney Island is a very approachable place with easy harbors and natural ocean currents that lead right to it. There's no safe place for the teachers. However, if you go just across the waters from Orkney Island, you reach a group of islands called the Faroe Islands. Now, the Faroe Islands have all sorts of built-in protections in them. They've got, the islands are characterized by high sheer cliffs that you can't climb up. There are narrow waterways between the islands that are, that daily there are small tornado type storms that pass through there. There are vortexes, water vortexes that protect against ships coming in. There are narrow shoals to the edges of the islands that a ship might run aground on. There are all sorts of natural protections there to keep a person who shouldn't be there from coming there. And up on the islands, you have structures that for all the world look like pyramids.
Huh.
Including one that's a pretty good match for the bent pyramid in Egypt.
How do you get there to these Faroe Islands?
Faroe, just right across the water from Orkney Island.
Yeah, but how do you get up on them? It's dangerous.
Well, they have to lower boats down by rope, and and a person can climb up, like with a rock climber can climb up.
Really?
Yeah, really. For a long time, that's what happened. There were periods of time when, in ancient times, when sailors would be unable to cross from one island to the next island for periods of months because of weather.
Is that like Scylla and Charybdis? The Greek?
Yeah, pretty similar.
Because there's nothing like that in the Med that I know of.
No, but it's certainly there. And the islands have not been excavated. They've not been explored. Nobody who knows what was there before the first Vikings visited
Do
there.
people live there now?
There are a few people who are living there now, yeah. But
Really?
they are of very odd habits, and they
Can imagine.
yeah, it's nobody knows for sure what happens there. You get to Orkney Island, the first reports of people being found, the first Scandinavian visitors found two groups there. One, a group of pygmies of very odd habits. Now, the Dogon refer to their teachers as Numo. The Egyptian word for pygmy is Nem. So we have some phonetic connection there. But these pygmies were associated with a group of people who were described as clerics, which is a good description of the Dogon themselves. And the Scandinavians were very conservative about how they described things, but they said that these clerics were so different from the Scandinavians that they might have been considered a different race as opposed to a different profession. In places like Caithness, they're outwardly described as black. There are DNA studies done on the islands that show DNA connections to Egypt and to North Africa.
Really?
There's lots of stuff. Actually, Orkney Island is probably one of the most genetically diverse places in the world.
Really?
Really, and they aren't sure why. They're attributing the North African DNA to contact with pirates in the in historical times.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any way of knowing that from the DNA. So there's all sorts of different things connected with that could potentially be right. But the book, it will be controversial, if nothing else.
Well, that's good. All right. Let's cover what you guys coming up. You obviously have this book coming up. Are you already writing another one on top of that?
That book is submitted. I expect it'll be out in 2016. I haven't actually signed a contract on it yet, but it's there and accepted.
Is that going through Inner Traditions?
That'll go through Intertraditions, right. Then there's a follow-on to that about the Maori in New Zealand that's about half written. But the Maori have memories of Orkney Island.
Really?
And they actually established schools for their priests where the same things that I say were taught on Orkney Island were being taught in these schools. There are lots of linguistic connections there also. It's hard to get into without a lot of detail that I probably am not prepared to provide. But basically, in the Maori in New Zealand have connections back to Göbekli Tepe, to the 3200 BC era stuff that I talk about on Orkney Island, to the Shakti cult that I connect to Göbekli Tepe, to ancient Egypt, and to things down the line from ancient Egypt. Things play out in terms of rituals and in terms of words and practices, in terms of myths of where they came from and how they got there.
Okay. And John, you do trips to Egypt still?
Oh yeah, of course, yes. And now is a great time to go because the prostitutes of the media have published all of this stuff and make it sound. I mean, there's stuff going on there, but it's strictly political so far. Nobody's after the tourists, but they make it sound as though it's an open civil war, so that tourism is way, way down, which is calamitous for the poor Egyptians, but fantastic for us, because to visit Egypt when it's still pretty empty it's a tremendous advantage. And so, yes, I'm still doing my trips, of course. As long as I can keep climbing up the pyramid, I'll keep doing the trips.
I'm sure climbing up the pyramid keeps you in shape to keep climbing up the pyramid.
Not bad for my age, yeah, not bad.
The last time there was upheaval in Egypt, John was out of contact for a few days, and people started to be concerned, and so I started trying to track him down. And he reassured me by sending me a photo of himself and a beautiful young companions sitting on a private cruise ship sipping alcoholic beverages.
Yeah, that was the revolution. We were there for the whole revolution. And then we're trying to get together this, major follow-up for the Mystery of the Sphinx. And then Jacques and I've got a whole bunch of projects that, and I'm one of these rare people born with two Achilles heels, and both of them are organization. So for me to get anything done, I sometimes wonder, how I ever got anything done at all, because I'm so hopelessly disorganized. But somewhere along the line, things do get done. So I've got all of these different related projects, and in fact, some of the others of me wearing my Bohemian beret instead of my Egyptological pith helmet, of stuff going on and people interested in some of the other creative things that I've done. We'll see. I'm still here.
Good. You want to talk? Do you want to mention the book you might be doing with Jacques at some point?
Well, the first one will be called Dancing Down the Bridge of Sirah. This is a Sufi image, Bridge of Sirah, which is described as, and it's this bridge that you have to cross to get to, let's say, to the truth or to enlightenment. And it's described as narrow as the razor's edge, and on one side is the chasm of credulity, and on the other the abyss of skepticism. So this is the quackademics on one side and the unicorns on the other. And basically the story of the long Sphinx quest. It's basically the Sphinx quest, which has now been going on since I first encountered that one line of Schwaller back in, 72, 73.
Wow.
So it's 40 years it's been going. So it's a lot of story, and as you gather, we talked about some of it. This is really sort of real life Indiana Jones, because it's with a lot of interesting characters and skullduggery and people attacking other people. Yeah, there's a whole big long story there. So that's the first book, and then the second one, if we ever get around to it, is, I hope, the definitive destruction of the Darwinian delusion. We'll see about that.
Sounds interesting.
One last thing I'd like to say is that over the years there have been a number of occasions where John has one opinion about what a symbol or a ritual means, and my sources point to a different meaning. And so there's a difference of opinion between us as to what the thing actually means. What I've learned in those cases is that it means that I need to find some additional sources.
Well, no, not necessarily. Sometimes they're complementary. Sometimes they could be both.
No, actually they do.
Often
Typically they resolve, because when I do find those other sources, it serves as an umbrella over both points of view, and we end up realizing that you can look at it two ways. But what I'm saying is, it has not been my experience that John's wrong about something that he holds a strong opinion about.
Gotcha.
Well, I'm able to defend myself even if it's wrong.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this. Do you want to show people around some of the artifacts and stuff you have?
No artifacts. Books. You can see
You got
those.
books. You got some cool paintings over there.
Cool paintings. There's me and Abisa with the dog. That one over there. The rugs are the wall hangings of this really nice art form that they've developed in Egypt of woven, rug. They're not really tapestries in the usual sense. They're woven things of that's local scene, which is pretty accurate. And an even better one over there, the one with the pyramid.
Oh, wow.
That's got some magic to it. We did that one. And the little primitive paintings there, over there, that's a Visa, where I was with him all those years. And the one on the top with the little boat, the little fishing boat. It was our boat, my boat, named Shapiro Katoros.
Now, did you paint these?
No, I'm not. No,
Okay.
that was a very interesting local Spanish guy, Vicenco guy. And because that big bold painting of me looking like sort of a desert monk is by an ex-Finnish girlfriend, no longer with us, unfortunately. Others by another great friend of mine who just died. Those ones from drawn in Amsterdam back in the 50s. Other than that, well, what do you think? It's a writers, scholars. I call it my book style.
Awesome. Well, thank you.